Hi, everybody. It's Michael Bennett. And I want to thank Protect Our Winters for hosting this morning's event and for all the work you do to hold government accountable to pursuing durable climate policy. I think Colorado is the most beautiful state in America, but I've never been more worried about our future. And it's all because of climate change. Last month, we had the most destructive wildfire in our state's history in the dead of winter. And this past summer, when I was driving around the state, I couldn't see the mountains for days at a time because the haze from the California fires was so thick. Many people couldn't go outside because the air quality was dangerous for their health. And the major highway in our state, I-70, was closed for weeks because of mudslides and flash floods. People all over Colorado couldn't hike or bike or do the things that make us who we are. And these conditions are driving down our water supplies, shrinking our winters, and threatening our outdoor economy, especially the world-class skiing that is so central to Colorado and our way of life. If we don't act, I worry that we won't recognize Colorado in a few years. And that's why I've never felt more urgent about climate change than I do today. There's a lot we have to do to meet the moment, from cutting pollution to deploying clean energy to restoring our forests and watersheds to build resilience and reduce wildfire risk. What we can't do is waste any more time. We can't accept this as a permanent state of affairs. This is something we have to deal with today. We have to act now to save lives, to prevent terrible damage to our communities, to ensure our kids and grandkids can enjoy our public lands and experience the outdoors we all love. None of this will be easy. It never is in a democracy, but I can't think of any cause more worthy for your time and energy. So keep it up and know that I'm doing everything I can to make sure we meet the moment for Colorado, the next generation, and our outdoors. Thank you again for your work, and I hope to see all of you in person soon.
Michael Bennett. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. My name is Hillary Hutchison. I'm a fly fishing guide up in Northwest Montana, and I'm on the Protect Our Winters board. Protect Our Winters, as most of you know, was founded in 2007 by professional snowboarder Jeremy Jones. And at POW, we really aim to help outdoor enthusiasts who are very passionate about their families, their jobs, their friends, their livelihoods, to protect those livelihoods and the places that they love from climate change. So the reason that we are all here together this morning with you is because the cross-partisan actions that we can take are extremely important. So in an industry that's bringing 7.6 million jobs and $887 billion in economic revenue, we in the outdoor industry are uniquely positioned to depoliticize this climate discussion. So that's the conversation we're going to have here today. We have an awesome panelist board right now, and we'd love to just go down the line here and have everybody introduce themselves, and we're going to jump into some super hard-hitting math questions. It's way easier. Go ahead, Josh.
I'm Josh Jesperson, mountain guide based in Southwest Colorado, and I promise I'm a lot cleaner today than that photo.
Same. Those are the photos.
I'm Paige Thomas. I live in North Carolina. I'm a trail runner and a scientist.
Hi, I'm Senator Faith Winter from Colorado. She, her pronouns, and not professional at any of this, but I hike and camp a lot.
I'm Becky Edwards, and I'm from Salt Lake City. For 10 years, I served in the Utah House of Representatives and worked a lot on issues related to climate and air quality, and now I'm running for the U.S. Senate in the state of Utah.
Excellent. Let's welcome our panelists. And the cool thing about having these panelists is because we're coming from such unique backgrounds. And we'll go down the line starting with Josh, and I'm going to ask the same question to each of you, and then from then on you'll have individual questions. But first question is just, what is your unique experience that brings you into this conversation? Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. I feel like this thing has some feedback. So I think kind of one thing I bring to this is I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, Appalachia, down in a holler. So really country, and came from that background. Joined the military, spent 6 years as a Navy SEAL going to Iraq and Afghanistan, seeing lots of other parts of the world outside America. And I was snowed in at my fob in Afghanistan and wanted to get back to skiing because I kind of grew up a ski bum. And so I decided to get out of the military, move to Colorado, and completely immerse myself back in the mountains. I did that in 2011, and I started taking people outside as a guide, fellow veterans, wounded veterans, anybody who wanted to go. Found backcountry skiing. Was lucky enough in 2017 to climb and ski all of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks in a single ski season, beating the old record of 361 days and doing it in 138 days. But getting to see all the little disparate mountain towns in Colorado and the different cultures that they all have. Even though you think, oh, it's just a mountain town, it's the same as the rest. Not true. So with all that, I've gotten to see a lot of rural America, a lot of rural Colorado, and start to understand what these communities need to help them battle climate change in their own backyard, and so they don't suffer the effects of the climate change that we're all causing as a global community.
Thanks, Josh.
So I grew up I've lived in the Southeast pretty much my entire life. So I sort of bring that perspective to this panel, most people being from the West. As I mentioned, I'm a trail runner. I use running as my main way of seeing the world and connecting with people as well. It's a major source of joy for me to really have this innate connection with people on land. And with running, at least you can run in a variety of different places. And at least in the Southeast, what that has shown me is that not all trails are equal and not all communities are equal. Similar to what Josh was saying, there are a lot of communities that are really rural and have all of these beautiful places to recreate, but are struggling with the economy, and they're not all the same. And so I've come through this journey of environmental advocacy and science to use running to better connect with people about environmental issues, specifically environmental justice issues affecting mostly BIPOC communities. And then I'm also using that to inform my science, and I mostly study fish physiology, but I'm using that to connect with communities that have more traditional ecological knowledge of particular ecosystems and areas that scientists, when they're not necessarily from those areas, can deeply connect with and fully understand. And so I sort of bring both of those things to the table, I think.
Growing up, so I'm fifth generation Colorado, and we would routinely go to the mountains and go hiking and camping. And in my family, every single night we had dinner together, we'd have our nightly prayer. And from the ages of about 5 until 15, I prayed for the same thing every night. One was to end homelessness, and the other was that God would make more waterfalls, because I wanted more waterfalls. And we've seen our waterfalls at risk in Colorado, and it was a really important part of me growing up. And so I became an environmental management major and became a scientist. And I thought that's how I could actually save the world, was through science. And I ended up sitting in labs at 4 p.m. on Friday a lot. And I love scientists. If you're a scientist out there, I'm not disparaging you. But I realized that we actually had to have the policy and the political gumption behind the science to create systemic change. And I became a community organizer, which led me to running for office. And I originally ran in 2007, which is also when POW was created, working to make my city the first solar city in the state, and then moving on to the state level, where the most significant legislation I passed was setting our carbon reduction goals in Colorado, which we're working to meet. And what motivates me is both my love of the outdoors and love of our state and the impact it has, but also protecting it for my children. I have a 10-year-old and 12-year-old, and taking them out in the magic around a campfire or hiking and the joy that they get, I want to protect for them and for the rest of the folks of Colorado.
That's awesome. I grew up in Utah, and some of that background is similar. As a multi-generations family from Utah, doing a lot of camping and hiking with my family, and at a young age, got introduced to my first set of skis, borrowed from a neighbor, wood skis with old school bindings, and grew up skiing at Sundance, and that really grew a tremendous love of mine of skiing and being outdoors in a way that my family hadn't done before. And now my husband and I are taking our grandkids skiing, and it's wonderful and deeply concerning when I think about the potential for change for some of the access to our outdoor environment. For me, from a political standpoint, when I first ran in 2008 for the Utah House and then served for 10 years, air quality and climate were already huge issues in my community. We have 5 oil refineries in my district, a medical waste incinerator, and it was something that both Republicans and Democrats have been talking about for a long time. When I got to the Utah House, though, as a Republican, there wasn't a lot of leadership on air quality and climate, and it puzzled me because I thought, why? There's no airshed for Democrats and a separate airshed for Republicans. These are things that matter to everybody, and the climate impacts all of us. And so I started to push legislation to help support air quality in Utah, and was successful working with a model that I think is supported by Protect Our Winters and so many, of working across the aisle and finding common ground and just getting the work done. And then in 2018, this was my last legislative session, I was really fortunate to be able to be the sponsor on a piece of legislation that became the very first legislation in a red state anywhere in the country to actually acknowledge climate change. And it became groundbreaking for many other states. The day it passed, the day after it passed, we started to get phone calls from around the country and other states wanting to know how we had accomplished this, and it became the foundation for additional work that the state of Utah is doing on climate and a roadmap that they're sort of following on climate and air quality. And so it was something that when I decided to run for the U.S. Senate, I'm in a race right now for that I'm deeply committed to doing more on that front. I think there is movement that can be made on a national front that requires a certain type of leadership and a deep commitment to this issue. And coming from Utah, I have a deep appreciation for our beautiful environment. We share some of those mountain ranges here in Colorado, and of course with the West, and also from a business standpoint. You know, the ski industry is incredibly important to the state of Utah. In many ways, they're great partners on so many things, and of course, from an economic standpoint, they really matter. And so having conversations around climate that bring in all these different viewpoints and voices, I think there's just a lot that we can do, and I really appreciate Powell for convening this panel and giving us an opportunity to discuss together some of those.
Thank you. Yes, it can be fun.
Yeah.
For sure. Josh, we talked a lot last night, kind of as we were prepping for this, about the role of the outdoor industry in climate solutions. We all know we're here, we're doing it. What is our role and responsibility as you see it?
Yeah, thanks. Giving me the first chance to just call the industry out right off the bat.
Sure.
I'm kidding. I really do think, though, it's like starts in the name, right? The outdoor industry. And we're accountable to the outdoors. We rely on the outdoors. She said earlier when, I'm sorry, I forget who that was, but she said that the outdoor industry relies on public lands. And I think that's kind of true with this sector particularly. So we have to find ways to be accountable to that land and the people that live on it. And then beyond that is kind of communication. I think it's important for all these brands to communicate with each other, tell each other what you're doing, how you're helping, and hey, how can you both help together instead of being kind of competitive in that way. And then from the Purple Mountains perspective, I think it's also important to recognize that the hunting and fishing crowd may not feel so welcomed in this building for certain reasons. I don't know what those may be. But we need to find a way to merge both sides of this vast industry and meet those perspectives in the middle, and find ways where we can all come together. This side of the house calls it climate change, the other side calls it conservation. Why aren't we using the same language? Because we don't feel welcomed in each other's spaces, and I don't think that's a good way forward. So I think that's kind of the role that we can all play, is bringing everybody together to help each other.
Right, excellent. The connectivity is huge, which brings me to a conversation I had with Peyton about why do we care about each other when we're geographically so far apart. So for me as a fishing guide up in the Rocky Mountains, and then for you running trails in the Carolinas, why do we care what's happening to each other's ecosystems? And so that's my question for you, is why is that important that somebody from the Southeast cares what's happening to skiers and snowboarders in the mountains?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, my perspective has always been in it. I think this sort of comes from just being in science and heavily involved in biology, is that like the main premise of everything is that everything is interconnected. We don't live in a vacuum. Things that are happening on the coast are directly impacting things going on in the mountains and vice versa. Myself as a trail runner, I run in mountains in Colorado as well as I run in mountains in North Carolina. What's going on with the snowpack and landslides and water loss in the mountains directly impacts things that are going on in the coast. When we see glaciers melting, that's causing sea level rise. The oceans and snowpack are major sources that are absorbing the most heat right now under climate change. And so it's extremely important, and we're seeing impacts on both of these sides. So yeah, I think it's important for everyone to care about things that are going on in all of the areas of the world, and we need to be communicating with each other about those impacts and what we can do together. And I think Hillary, because you have amazing experience as a fishing guide, talking with people from all over the country about things going on with their fishing communities, and you're all trying to problem solve together. And I think that's beautiful, and we can do that with more people and more industries. We should be doing that.
The opportunity to problem solve is something that we do all have in common that I think is huge, and something else that probably the most important thing that we all have in common is our opportunity to speak to our elected leadership. So it brings me to the next question for the two of you. Ms. Edwards, you running for U.S. Senate as a Republican in a red state, how do you speak to your constituents?
I think, about climate specifically, a lot of that comes to finding common language, finding an area that you can find common ground on. So that might be family, that might be the economy, it might be love of public lands, it might be outdoor rec, it might be whatever. But finding that space and then starting there, starting small. Like I mentioned the climate bill that I ran. After we got, let me just back up. I worked with an amazing group of high school students on this piece of legislation. They had been so energized around climate, and they brought some language on the bill that was I didn't think was going to pass in a solidly red state. So we made some changes to the language, and I thought, okay, I think we're at a place where this can actually pass. But then I started to shop this around. This was in May, and our legislative session doesn't start till January. And we have 75 members in the House, and I started with the people I knew would hate this bill the most. I didn't start with my friends that I knew would be supportive. And I remember so clearly that very first conversation with a rural state representative who had spoken out and have actually run legislation previously as a climate denier. And I said, hey, I want to walk through this with you, and I want to know where we went too far, what words aren't working, what we left out. And so it wasn't a super long piece of legislation, but like 30 seconds in, he just turns it over and says, I can't vote for this, Becky. Like, you haven't even read the whole thing. Keep going, it gets better. Come on. He said, no, what's the problem? He said, right there in the title, it says climate change. You know that's not real. I said, well, technically I don't know it's not real, because I think it is real, and I think you know it's real too. He said, no, I don't. I said, well, what about this thing and this thing? I'm starting to kind of go through some data points and Utah-specific demarcations of climate or changing climate. He said, oh yeah, that's not climate change. That's just our climate is changing. Like, okay, I took my pen, scratched out climate change, wrote changing climate at the top. And he's like, oh, yeah, I can vote for that now. For real. And I thought, okay, that is easy. If you put aside sort of like how much we really feel strongly about particular words, and we were able to change that, maintain the integrity of the legislation, and then with his support, and then talking person after person, you know, so that the work, the tenacity that takes, you've got to be in this for the long haul. Finally, when the legislative session comes in January, I already have the votes, it passes out of the House, and the House floor goes to the Senate committee that the previous year would not even give this legislation a place on an agenda. They vote for it unanimously, passes out of the Senate, and then the next day, like I said, we started to get calls. CNN, New York Times, state of Texas, state of Alabama, and they're all calling and saying, did you just pass, did we just hear this right? Did Utah just pass the first piece of legislation in a red state acknowledging climate change in the whole nation? I'm like, well, technically it was changing climate, but yes. And I mean, it's sort of like a funny thing, but the reality here is that words matter, and people feel if a word or a phrase was going to be a barrier for me at that time, I was willing to move past that and actually go to a place where we could find common ground and we could move forward. This very same year, there was another one of my colleagues who was running also a bill on climate change. And he is a physician, and so his bill was like lots of sciencey stuff, and it was really important. And my bill was more on, hey, this is something, this is real, and it's impacting our energy resources here in the state and our communities, and what do we do diversifying our energy portfolio, and how do we mitigate this going forward, etc. But his bill was very much in the science part of this, and people said, we're going to have climate fatigue. You cannot possibly have two bills. I mean, realize we have like, I don't know Colorado, but we have probably 1,000 bills we hear every year, like 2 on climate. I don't think that qualifies as climate fatigue, but they said you should really combine your pieces of legislation and just try and pass one. So I talked to my colleague, and he said, no, I don't want to cooperate. I don't want to find common ground. I don't want to change words. I want to have the purity of my message, and I just want to have an opportunity to speak in front of a committee and testify with my reality and what I don't want to water down. So we moved forward, and my bill passed and his didn't, but he did have an opportunity to speak all of his truth and the purity of the message, which was a different approach. But for me, I have found effectiveness in finding common ground and moving forward, and that you can actually do both.
Right. Senator Winter, as Edwards was talking about words matter, language matters. For you, as a scientist and progressive, and somebody who's prioritized the environment for your constituency, how do you use language in finding common ground across the aisle?
Yeah, it's really important to find that common ground. And it's like Peyton said, when people come together and work towards solutions, it's a beautiful thing. And ultimately, I consider myself a community organizer. And that means you have to bring people together. And the very first tenet of organizing is that you start with where people are at. And that's why it's really important to listen and to tell stories. And so if you take anything away today, is when you're interacting with your elected officials, when you're asking for us to pass legislation, start with the story of why you're there, right? And so we started our panel on why are we connected to the land? Why do we care about protecting our winters? And what happens is when we all told our stories, right? And they're all different and unique, but we ended up connecting with each other. Because when you tell a story, you come to the table with your values and your experiences. And then someone else tells their story, and they come to the table with their values and experiences, and you find common ground. Because you can disagree on a specific order of words, you can disagree, unfortunately, on science and the impact, But you can't tell me that my experience of growing up and praying for waterfalls every night is wrong, right? Because that's my truth, that's my story, and you probably find some beauty in that. And I'm gonna find beauty in why you are a participant in the outdoor industry. Are you an athlete? Are you a creative person? Are you actually starting a business? Are you an entrepreneur? I want to know why it matters to you that we protect our lands and protect our winters. And when you start with your stories, you can actually build movements together. So you mentioned your colleague was a physician. So this morning I'm here with all of you with the outdoor industry. This afternoon I'm talking to a bunch of med students from CU Medical School that care about climate. And when I bring them in, and I bring you in, and I bring moms in that care about the health of their kids and their lungs, that's how we build movements and actually create critical change.
Excellent, thank you. So when we talk about solutions, you know, at POW we talk a lot about our strategies and tactics. We talk about adding jobs, reducing emissions, and adding renewables. And with those strategies and tactics, what we see as solutions to saving the planet, reducing our emissions, we also realize that they can be reflected differently in our different outdoor communities. So my next question, we'll start with you, Josh, is how do climate solutions best reflect our unique background?
Yeah, it's interesting because it depends where you live, right? I got to have a meeting with the governor yesterday, and they were talking about a lot of the great things that Colorado is doing based around electric vehicle infrastructure. There's this awesome e-bike program and some other things happening. And I kind of realized as he was talking that a lot of that stuff is helping urban Colorado. It's not stuff that's going to help rural Colorado. And so I asked that, and he had some answers, but he didn't have the best answers. Even though they're definitely trying, it did feel like the rural Coloradan is not a central part of the conversation. So I think it's important to realize that all these old mining towns and all these old towns that used to be based on extraction are finding a path forward with tourism, with outdoor recreation. So the outdoor industry, how do we help these small towns have like a just transition rather than a transition where it's like a large tourist community comes in, second homes come in, and then those people don't have a good way forward to survive in their towns and help prevent climate change from happening there. So it really depends on where you come from. And I think for the rural American, it's based on ending the extraction practices and finding a healthy tourist economy moving forward that is based on a healthy climate.
And Josh, you and I tend to be in the same boat sometimes where we get a little bit siloed, like you had made the point that sometimes people make assumptions that, you know, there's kind of, if you talk about being a fisherman, then it means something, or if you talk about having been in the military for so long, thank you for your service, it means something different to someone else other than what it means to you. How do you find that impacting your climate action?
Oh, that's a great question. Sometimes I feel like I can't maybe be a part of the conversation because I have a military background or I come from rural America, and I have to like find ways to weasel myself into the conversation through the common ground. Because initially people may make assumptions about me just based on my background, when in reality I want the same thing. I really do. So I loved your story about how he wanted his truth to be heard, and he really wanted to tell that story, but his ability to pass. And yours did by finding common ground. So I'm very much okay with like standing aside a conversation, listening, finding ways where I can enter the conversation through that common ground, and just give it a minute, let it kind of stew, and then get in maybe on something I don't initially want to talk about, like that's okay, but then we're going to talk about the things that we need to talk about.
Yeah, for me, I came to PAL because I couldn't find a place to get myself into the climate conversation within the fly fishing industry about 10 years ago when I felt like that was something important I needed to do. And that's why I came knocking on a door that at the time was skiers and snowboarders pretty exclusively. And I just asked Jeremy, I am willing to go on the snow with you if you will come on the water with me, you know, and so we all need winter, and that's when we kind of started to expand into working with athletes, people like Peyton, who are trail runners, and then mountain bikers, climbers. So Peyton, the same question for you. How do climate solutions reflect your unique background in the outdoor industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow, sorry, I just blanked. Yeah, me as a trail runner, I sort of run in a variety of different places. And so I would say that similarly to Josh, climate solutions are not going to be the same for every community that you go through. And climate solutions for runners and skiers are not all going to be the same. We have different things that we are concerned about, like whether our trails are eroding or whether snow is even there so you can get down the mountain. And so I think that there are different avenues within that for at least different athletes in particular to work locally maybe on their trails. Mostly the advocacy that I do is focused very locally. So I would say a lot of people can very easily get into that and find climate solutions within their small communities. So with running, for example, and me being a coastal person, a lot of my climate advocacy is running on trails that have been damaged by hurricanes or increasing floodwaters. You know, that happens pretty frequently, at least where I live, and it's increasing now. I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and it is one of the major flood risk zones for the next, it's projected to be like a meter of sea level rise in the next 20 years. And then there are also all of these other industries that are trying to come into this area to build and will further increase erosion risk. So for me, at least, like climate solutions for Wilmington, North Carolina are not going to be the same as climate solutions that are for like Vail, Colorado. And so I think it's just getting really tapped in locally, at least, to what is going on in your community. I talk a lot about, rebuilding trail, how can we decrease erosion risk in our area, decrease the, because there's a lot of logging industries as well in the Southeast, and so trying to mitigate that risk as well, providing more opportunities for known clean renewables in our area. Thank you.
Senator Winter and Ms. Edwards, do you have any suggestions that are specific to folks who are out here today in terms of how they can either change language or strategy or tactics as members of the outdoor state? You know, I mean, if all of us in this outdoor state were a state, we would be the most powerful in the entire nation. And that's, certainly a way for us all to continue to think about us having this growth and power of being able to speak to our elected leadership. But how? What would you say, if you could give tips to these people, which you get to now, in terms of how to speak to you?
Your experience is completely valid, and share that, right? Because it's a unique perspective. Sometimes it's a different perspective than what we're hearing in the climate debate, right? So often we get caught up in the IPCC report and degrees and how much it's rising, when really talking about how, well, when there's this many days of snow, I get to hire this many employees in my small town, right? And having the actual impact to real life people and families and businesses motivates folks like us to take action, because it's our job. Our job is to turn your hopes and dreams into policy reality. And we can't do that in isolation, right? There's this myth in America that you are elected and all of a sudden you're super smart and you just come up with all the solutions from an ivory tower, right? But actually, I love politics because it's a team sport. And I'm only as strong as the teams we build, and bringing you with me is really important, because then I can share your stories and your perspective and talk about how it impacts how many employees you have and how it impacts athletes. And all the entrepreneurs that are coming up with the best new gear so we can use the snow even more, right? And I can't tell that by myself. I can only tell that when you work with me. And also reach out to the people working on this. So I represent the suburbs of Denver, North Glen, Westminster, Thornton. Now I imagine many of you live in different places in the country or different places in Colorado. And I think there's this idea that if your elected official that actually represents your area doesn't care about it, then you're just left out. Well, it's not true. So find the champion in your area that's championing the outdoor industry. Find the champion in your state that's working on climate issues, because they're looking for partners, they're looking to build coalitions, and we can't do it alone, and we welcome the input and feedback, and because that's what it's going to take to actually get significant policy across the finish line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that, you know, bringing people together is find alliances with like-minded people in the outdoor community. So this, you know, you mentioned fisher, hunter, snowboard, skier, hiker, trails. I mean, these are all groups who care deeply about the environment, and they all kind of make sense. But then there are, like Senator Winters mentioned, moms who just want to make sure that their kids can actually go outside during recess the whole month of January. Where in Utah sometimes that can't happen because our air quality is so bad, it's indoor recess day. So remember that there are people around your communities who care deeply. Moms, businesses, the classic story in Utah that I think really became a turning point for many Republicans. In a committee that I was chairing for 6 years, I was the chair of the Economic Development and Workforce Services Committee. And so this was, you know, the outdoor rec, and actually we created and funded the very first Office of Outdoor Recreation in the state. It was kind of exciting. It was a small investment, but it has grown, and it's really an economic engine that is producing great things for the state and making an impact on climate. But here's my point. Here's the story. A member of the community from the business community is testifying, and the bill being discussed at that point was something around tax incentives for either relocating a new business to the state of Utah or a significant expansion of an existing business. And they were talking about one of the challenges was they go to the airport in Salt Lake City, and that's maybe 15 minutes from downtown Salt Lake, and the airport is just west of the city. You drive in on the main road, and you can see the city right there the whole time you're driving in. And this was during January when we had super bad inversion, and that's a month where our air quality is the worst. And they don't even get that 15 minutes in before the executive who's coming to check Utah out to relocate their company here said, turn around. I can't sell this, meaning the air quality. I can't sell that. Turn me around. I'm going to go somewhere else. And that story, that one story, like you said, like was a light bulb for people. Oh, this has economic impact. And suddenly that started some conversations that were different than we had had in the past. And so now we're having, you know, the business community talking to folks from the ski industry, talking to people in the fishing industry, and all kind of coming together. Wow, what do we actually do about climate? And scientists at our flagship university who are doing science around this, and really realizing that this is different than a lot of conversations we have in politics, where there is no, it's not a zero-sum game. There is not just one resource that can be handed to you, and that means you don't get it. Climate change and mitigating this problem and making a sea change for all of us makes all of this better. And so it's very different than a lot of conversations you have in politics. So that abundance mentality, I think, when you align with another group, this group that just spoke about increasing inclusion in outdoor recreation, and with BIPOC and LGBTQ communities and others, that is something that we should all get behind. and the business community and all the other facets of this, I think we can align better when we see each other in silos, break down the silos, the boxes, and just say, bring everything you can to the table. And I love that you shared the story of you calling up, knocking on the door, protect our winners, hey, I want in, help me, I want to contribute here. And that's what we have to do. We have to have that mentality. And the table is big. If there's not a chair for you, bring it in, bring your own chair, and make your voice heard. It really matters, and there's so much good that can happen when we work together like that.
I want to follow up real quick. I love that you want to hear anecdotal evidence. I think stories are amazing. When I go to DC for my other nonprofit, and we're trying to get legislation passed, they also want numbers to help with that. So what numbers would you like this industry to compile? What data analytics do they need to come at legislators with and say, these are the things that we're being most affected by, please help us?
So building on what you talked about earlier in having a true just transition, right? So oftentimes we hear how many jobs are in the outdoor industry, for example, and how many billions of dollars that contributes to the economy. And one of the pieces of legislation I'm most proud of is Colorado actually is the first state to have an Office of Just Transition. And as you mentioned, each mountain town's different. There's a lot of different towns that were based on extraction. So we have Nucla here, we have Craig here. And our Office of Just Transition is just getting up and going and trying to make that community specific. And so I think the overall big, really impressive numbers of here's the jobs and here's the impact on the economy, but then having some numbers for that small town, right? Because that small town having 10 new jobs actually probably means more than the thousands and thousands you're telling me about, right? Because that 10 jobs in Craig or Nucla is actually going to keep families in their homes, it's going to keep libraries open, schools open, and that matters. And so really, how are we having this conversation about a just transition and what that looks like? Because whether we're talking about how many jobs are in the renewable energy industry, the energy efficiency industry, how many jobs are creating electric vehicles, how many outdoor industry jobs, right? There's a lot of jobs addressing climate, but what's happening to that coal miner's family in Craig, right? And we have to start transitioning to, and I didn't even mean that, but like just transition, right? And so having those numbers would be really helpful.
Excellent. Quick answer to this because I want to get to one more with Josh and Peyton. What are some of those hard numbers that you would like people to know?
There's a lot of science out here, and I think the jobs numbers is certainly part of that. I think here's my pitch that I want to make here for people in this space to be really patient with their elected leaders. They're not experts on this issue, and there's a lot of turnover. In Colorado you have term limits. In Utah, the average period of service in the Utah State Legislature is like 6 years. So I think a lot of times people in a particular space get really tired of like same message over and over, and they feel like they're constantly re-educating. Be patient with that, because that actually, you're laying seeds of education and groundwork that can really develop into something later. So I just want to, I understand the frustration if you feel like you're saying the same thing over and over. Keep it up. And the connection between a particular community, I think, is really important. And if you can think of one small thing that they could do, or another resource you could connect them to, or in this case, on a federal level, we now have a House and Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. They're intentionally equal parts, Republican and Democrat. They're equally bipartisan by design. And then separately, Representative John Curtis from Utah has started in the past year a conservative climate caucus. And so those are great resources. Look at the work that's already being done. See how you can kind of like grab a hold of that, add to it. And I think that's another good way to do it.
Thank you. In this breakdown of the Purple Mountains, and people kind of trying to look at where in these Purple Mountains someone sits, sometimes it can be hard to stay focused on our climate solutions when we have so many other things to disagree about. Josh, how important is it that if we're on a path toward working on science solutions, that we don't do what I call the Tupperware party, where we kind of have just like-minded people in the same room buying each other's crap. How important is it to get out of the Tupperware party and make sure that we recognize we definitely aren't going to have all of these things in agreement, and so many other social situations and even environmental situations, but if we're focused on climate, how important is it to continue to get into the room together?
I think it's super important. Has anybody ever been in a conversation where somebody brings up one point, somebody brings up another point, and then at the end you realize you didn't really come to any conclusions? So climate change to me is like the priority issue. It's the biggest thing that we need to tackle, and I'll just keep this brief because I think my point is when we start solving climate change, a lot of these other issues that we're having as a nation and as a world will also start falling over like dominoes.
You guys, that's all the time that we have for today, and I really encourage everybody who is in this room to take the opportunity to reach out and speak to any of the panelists who you see here. I know they're all open to it. And also, you are all part of the outdoor state, so again, encourage you all to become a supporter of Protect Our Winters. With 130,000 plus now, you have a great community of people who go beyond just that Tupperware party. So there will be like-minded people, but also people from very diverse backgrounds. And please remember, as you meet them, that they can be like us. We're not always what you assume. There might be people who are worth the deeper conversation to get to know. And finding common ground isn't always just very surface level. Sometimes it's deep, it's always worth the deep dive. And I encourage everybody to go to the Protect Our Winters website, check it out, look around and see how you can be involved in your own area. There are local and community and then national, state level opportunities for everybody. And please continue to have fun out there and continue to do it because we're all here on the water together, on the snow together. We're all here together, and I think that you'll find the support from one another can help you on your own climate journey. So thanks everybody for being here today. Don't leave yet because there's lots more to come, but thank you, and please give our panelists a big round of applause.